Well, welcome to another edition of Truthout Radio. I'm Ted Asregadoo, and we're going to talk about debt with Marisa Holmes. She is an artist and an agitator who's been active in Occupy Wall Street and Strike Debt, and she has an opinion piece in Truthout called Debt versus Democracy, the Battle for the Future. Hello, Marisa, and welcome to Truthout Radio.
Hi, Ted. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So tell our viewers about the crisis of debt that you write about in your Truthout piece.
Well, the crisis of debt has been going on for centuries. It's as old as debt itself. And in 2008, we really saw that debt crisis hit the U.S. and the first world generally. For the last 30, 40 years, there's been structural adjustment happening in other places in the world, in the third world, through IMF and World Bank loans that were predatory and spun countries into incredible poverty and due to these debts that they could not possibly pay back, right? And on certain conditions that enabled large corporations, multinational, transnational corporations, to come in and exploit that situation. So for decades, you know, under this era of neoliberalism and globalization, we saw the structural adjustment of third world nations, which plunged them into debt, but that never really hit the first world. Like, we were sort of, even though we were taking on credit debt and student debt, medical debt, it didn't really hit like this crisis moment until 2008. And so I go back to 2008 in the piece because I think it's a really like crystallizing moment in which the world kind of woke up to into this transfer of wealth from the 99% to the 1%.
And I think at one point, I mean, we were talking before we went live about how that year, that 2008, was not only a watershed year in a negative way in terms of the way in which debt had sort of crushed people, but it affected you personally. I mean, this was the year that you graduated from college, isn't that correct?
Yeah, so I'm the class of 2008. That was my undergrad graduation year, and it was really it was kind of nerve-wracking. It was a shock to the system. You know, it was a shock to this global system, but also like my personal emotional system, and just realizing that you know, I was not going to be taken care of. That actually there are no job prospects, very few job prospects for recent grads. And the class of 2008 has over 40% default rate. We're particularly disadvantaged in the course of things. So yeah, I mean, it forced me to look at this larger system that I was part of and make connections with other people who are going through the same kind of experiences. So like when I showed up at Zuccotti Park, I was definitely interested in working around debt and talking to people about, you know, why they were there. And, you know, and there were a lot of like student debtors. There were a lot of people that were faced with like mounting medical bills because of the privatization of health in this country, and then just all sorts of issues. And you realize that like just the basic sort of means of survival are robbed from people. Like they can't possibly sustain their basic needs, like housing and healthcare and education. And so, and usually those needs, you know, would be taken care of by the social, the larger social body, like whether it's, you know, a council or government. But in this case, it's certainly not being taken care of, and so it's a failure of democracy, like the modern liberal democracy that, you know, purports to actually take care of the social wealth is not doing that. That contract is broken, and so in lieu of that, we need to do things ourselves. And so we do things through direct democracy, through consensus, which is a form of direct democracy, but through the sharing of our own wealth and taking care of one another through support systems. And now we're seeing that play out with the rolling Jubilee and some of what's happening with Occupy Sandy. So the movement is responding to this by, you know, creating our own systems, because we realize that the existing social and political institutions are not serving our needs, so we need to serve them ourselves.
Well, I think you highlighted a couple of things, and one of the things I wanted to talk about was direct democracy. So you had gone to essentially a conference, Agora 99, is that what it was called?
Yeah, it was Agora 99 in Madrid in November, and it was the first meeting of Occupy and the Indignados in Europe. There have been a lot of cross-pollination between movements before, and certainly a lot of people from 15M, from the 15M movement had come to New York and helped with Occupy Wall Street. But this was like the first sort of major convergence in which the movements talked about next steps, the phase 2 of what the movement would become. And we framed it around like debt and democracy. And so both this confrontation with financial institutions through debt resistance and also the building of alternatives through this directly democratic model. And in this case, we're using consensus. So, and it's just the start, right? Because you start with this decision-making process, which enables like other things to emerge, which enables like worker co-ops and collectives and other alternative economies to form and new forms of social relations and sharing of social wealth. And so, so it's really a first step in phase 2. But I think people are starting to realize that this is a real resistance. It's not enough to go to the square. The square is sort of the first step of delegitimizing existing institutions and of opening up the space for discourse. And we kind of won the discourse, and now we're looking to build a real resistance.
And you talked a little bit about direct democracy solutions, and I'm sure that the number of groups that were in attendance and some of the ideas that came out of it, when you have democratic movements, there are a variety of solutions. So could you name maybe one or two of the direct democracy solutions that were talked about and perhaps will be implemented by in some form here in North America?
Mm-hmm. Well, in Spain, they talk a lot about constituent process, and what they mean by that is using direct democracy, using like the assembly model, but really like a confederated and sometimes federated assembly model to draft an alternative constitution for Spain. Like that's actually like they're talking about it on that level, and we haven't developed enough in the U.S. to do anything remotely like that. They're much farther along in Spain, but yeah, I mean, they're drafting in like parallel governance is what they're doing, and all that goes along with that. So like, how do you build support systems? How do you build alternative economic models, like collectivization? All of that sort of starts in the assembly. And so like in Spain, they have a lot of social centers, a lot of occupied social centers. We met in this network of social centers in Madrid that had been occupied since the square, since leaving the square. And they're building like cooperative community kitchens and meeting spaces and housing, squatted housing cooperatives. And so we need to think about like what those alternative institutions look like here, and also like how to scale them. But they're farther along in Spain than we are now here.
You use the term illegitimate debt in your op-ed piece, and you did highlight also, much like these direct democracy movements, is that they're varied in form and in the way that they're implemented. So illegitimate debt means different things for different people. So what does it mean to you?
Illegitimate debt is predatory. It preys on the very sustenance of life. It deprives people of their ability to live, like debt around housing and healthcare and education, things that that should be available to everyone, that should be accessible to everyone. Like those are not things that you should have to take out debts for. That should be something that is just taken for granted. All those things should be taken for granted.
Right. You shouldn't have to go into debt for basic standard of living
right.
issues. Like going to school is one thing. When you go to school and you have to take on debt, the idea is that okay, I'm going to take on a student loan. Maybe I'll take a personal loan from if I've got a family member who has the wherewithal to do so. But the idea being is that at the other end of college, there will be opportunities for you in form of employment that will allow you to pay back that debt and also live a better life. But as we found out, many of us found out in 2008, that wasn't necessarily the case, that kind of unspoken social contract had been broken, that nature of going into debt as an investment in a way had become less of a method to where you invest in yourself through a college education and getting an education and experience, and then moving into the marketplace with a certain skill set that has value, and that value pays more than minimum wage, one would hope, in a way that you could live a life that is comfortable, and you don't have to go into debt for things like food and medical bills and things like that. But that has been turned on its head. So, as you said, more and more is become pushed onto the individual in terms of debt, and that becomes in itself predatory, because it's not so much about investment, and it's just mostly about naked, profit and greed, trying to extract as much as they possibly can from an individual, and sometimes there's just not that much there. So it could lead to default, which is something that I think is certainly has happened within the last 4 to 5 years. But it also there are other solutions, and one of them that you highlight in there is a Jubilee. What is that about?
Well, the Jubilee is an ancient concept in Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia, and other regions. There were periodic defaults, like sanctioned defaults, in which governments just erased all of the debts, and there was a blank slate, clean slate for people to start with.
And they did this for a reason, though, because there was a point where they had to do it, because not doing it would have been catastrophic, correct?
Right. It would have been to the detriment of society as a whole. It would have torn society apart, and also because there are periods of unrest. So when people don't have the ability to feed themselves, they tend to revolt, and then governments are forced to cancel the debts. So that's the ancient concept of the Jubilee. But with the rolling Jubilee in New York, what we're doing is we're not waiting on governments to do this for us. We're bailing each other out. So the people's bailout. And it's partially educational, like partially it's an exercise in just the absurdity of the debt market, that you can actually, buy $1 million worth of debt for 20 grand. I mean, the value of things is completely skewed. You realize that all of this is kind of meaningless to begin with. They're not going to extract these debts from people that it's just not, people can't pay, right? And that's why they're in the secondary and tertiary and other markets to begin with. It's because people are defaulting; they simply can't pay. So we're buying up, debt for pennies on the dollar, and then forgiving it. So it's a form of mutual aid and collective liberation, and we're hoping that other people will take this on, and they already are starting to take this on. There are other strike debt chapters throughout the country, and San Francisco has a strike debt group that's doing their own rolling Jubilee. So that's wonderful, and definitely the intention that that's sort of a pay it forward model where we started it and then other people do it for each other.
Okay. Well, you want to read the full piece that Marisa wrote? It's at truthout.org. Thank you so much for being on Truthout Radio, Marisa.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, and that's Truthout Radio for another week. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Ted Asregadoo.